All right, we're back, and it's COMP2007, and it's week 11, lesson 11, part 1. And last week we talked about membership from a security perspective, logging in, log out, all that stuff. This week I want to talk about identity, right? So there's this website I want you guys to go to. It's on the ASP.NET website, www.asp.net/identity. And if you go to the identity, just identity itself, I'm just going to go there first. So I'm just going to go to identity. So ASP.NET identity. If you wanted to get it from that link, it's if you click the overview, right? Overview. It talks about a little bit about how identity works and what identity is and stuff like that, right? We're going to talk about these kind of things. But this isn't the whole walkthrough that I want you guys to go through, right? Because again, this is, if you look at web projects in ASP.NET, they have a bunch of different ones, and they walk you through how to kind of create our web project and everything else, and host in the cloud, and the whole thing. Let me just go back. So here's identity. What I want you to do is overview, and then it says getting started, introduction to ASP.NET identity, right? Because that's where I want you to go. So getting started / introduction to ASP.NET, ASP.NET-identity. That's the link. Let's go there. At the same time, while you're doing that, we're going to kick off Visual Studio 2013. By the way, there's been an update. I should mention that because of the release of Visual Studio 2015, which has just been released this week on the 20th, right? It's an official release now for Visual Studio 2015. It's not the release candidate or the you don't have another type of release out there as well, where it's a trial or some kind of preview or anything like that. It's official. They have, because of that, they officially released Update 5 for Visual Studio 2013, which I've done. It shouldn't affect how mine looks compared to how yours looks, but there are some stability improvements for ASP.NET, as well as they give you the .NET Framework 4.6, if I'm not wrong. That's where it moved to, so 4.6, as opposed to 4.5, right? So remember that we were at 4.5.1, and now with the latest version of the .NET Frameworks at 4.6. So that's one of the things. If you're with me, and if you want to update your stuff, I recommend it's a good upgrade, right? Update for your for Visual Studio. It does take a while to do your update 5. Update 5 is like, a gig or 2 gigs of information to update. So doing it here in front of you guys doesn't make any sense to me. I'm just mentioning it to you. It doesn't affect anything that you'll do in terms of how we operate, but I think if you're a Visual Studio developer and if you're going to be using Visual Studio for the next year or so, it's a valid update. Now, would I recommend going to Visual Studio 2015 yet? I think you still should wait. And one thing is, if you look at DreamSpark, I'm just talking so you guys can get this link here. If I go to DreamSpark for Georgian, if you notice, we've got a technical preview for Windows 10 and kind of Windows you can download for Windows 8 and so on. But you don't see that there is a Visual Studio 2015 here. And you notice there is one for 2013. And the reason why is usually Microsoft waits a little bit longer to update this. It takes about 30 days or so. So you probably won't see a DreamSpark version of Visual Studio 2015 that's free for student users and faculty until probably September or so. My guess.
So we won't see it.
No, but just in case you do, you had for whatever reason you were using Visual Studio 2015 preview, it would have expired by now, which means you have to go. That's why I'm mentioning it, just in case you did something crazy like that. Some people like to be on the bleeding edge. They're the early adopters, if you will, of new technology. That's great, but now you're in trouble.
Are you downloading the update?
I don't recommend you do it in class, but yes, I would say Update 5. And if I looked at Visual Studio 2013. As an example, and if you notice, there's agents for Update 5 up here, but normally you have this Visual Studio 2013 Update 5 in here, and there isn't one. There is actually one at the bottom.
No, you have it in the Visual Studio itself. It comes up with a little yellow flag on the top.
You could download it from there as well through Visual Studio. I do recommend the update. I just don't recommend you do it right now. It takes about an hour to do.
Okay.
Yeah, that would be very bad. So if you started that update, bad for you, right? Or you can try and stop it or whatever. But that's a bad thing. And the other thing is, once you get the update, one thing we also mentioned is there's a couple things we use with Visual Studio. We have Visual Studio Web Essentials. Remember, you talked about that as something I highly recommend for HTML5 development. And they've updated everything. If you go to download, there's a new download for 2013. So if I go download, even though it says it looks like the same, it does say for 4 or 5. Requires update 4 or 5 now. And they've done a little update. So if you notice, the version is 2.6.12 of the Web Essentials, which means you'll have to re-download this as well, right? So that way you can keep on top of the latest and greatest stuff with HTML5 and CSS3. Really cool stuff. I think Visual Studio is definitely the way to go as a default platform. If you're going to use ASP.NET, it makes sense to use it. Some people don't like it, and they use other things like brackets and other things like that, which is totally fine. But just keep in mind that when you're doing this, the only thing you can do here is, and I highly recommend this, is download your updates and update your stuff. It says for update 4, but really this means for update 4 or 5, and that way you're up to date with me. And from an exam perspective, if you're going to run any code or anything like that, the reason why I wanted to make it so, and I talked to Rich about this as well, is we're thinking about kind of a multiple choice thing without using so much of a practical exam. Is for a couple of reasons. One, I think he's got a trip he's going to go on to, for the college. He's running away. One of the things he's doing. Number 2, and managing an exam that's more practical requires troubleshooting. 2, people have lots of troubleshooting issues on the midterm, right? Like stuff with, with Azure, how to connect to it. There's all kinds of stuff happening with Azure. Not that I don't want to test you on Azure, but I don't want that kind of trouble on the exam. Right? So I might ask you Azure questions. There might be some of those things, like in Azure, how do you create a blah blah blah? How do you deploy to Azure? What are the steps? Kind of thing. And then it might be multiple choice. And again, it's open book, open internet, all that kind of stuff. I'm always looking to make the exam something you can learn from also. And the reason for why I'm saying that is it's not just an exam to test you and to give you a mark, but also you come out of it and go, oh yeah, now I get it, right? Kind of stuff. Even if it's the final exam, I'm like that. I want to try and get you to say, okay, I get it now, right? If we do exams. So I just wanted to mention that. Yes?
You're talking about testing us on our knowledge to deploy to Azure.
To
I
Azure.
always take the Jackie approach. Is that one valid?
The Jackie approach is one valid method. But there are other methods, and so
you'll
you
test
should.
on the other methods.
I'll test you on whatever method I've talked about in class. So if I say to you as an example, using, without using the Jackie method, which is the Jackie method is using like some kind of GitHub, right?
Yep.
The GitHub deploy is nice, but the only thing with GitHub is when you move from staging into production, it does it automatically. So if it's a staging site that you're cutting over, the Jackie method is great because you're just updating the staging set all the time, right? If you want to control your deployments, then doing it within Visual Studio is also a good method as an alternative. You can do both ways, by the way. You can have one that directly uploads, so you control your stuff. And the other thing is you can also run with different branches, right? You can have a staging branch, and you can have a production branch or a master branch. And then the master branch is the stuff that pushes onto Visual Studio, but the branch that's deployed in GitHub, that's a staging branch where you're doing your tests and all that kind of stuff, or your debugging branch or whatever, that could be something that cuts over later. So there's different methodologies. What I'm going to be testing you on is the stuff I've talked about in class. I may talk about, there might be, what are the ways to do it from a deployment perspective, but I'll also talk about stuff like the whole thing about your entity framework. I tested you on it kind of in the midterm, like practically, right? But we're going to be talking about the entity framework, how to set up, a database first approach, that whole thing, setting up a data model, those kind of things. And I'm going to review stuff on the exam probably week 13. So that week 13, it would be the week before your, actually the week your assignment's due, right? So a couple weeks from now. So right now we're sitting at week 11. 2 weeks from now, week 13 is when your assignment's due, your group assignment, right? And then that week 13, we'll also do kind of a, I'll try and do a review, right, with you. So cover all the topics we talked about through the entire course. By the way, anything from the course is valid on the exam. It's not going to be just on the second half. It's going to be everything we've talked about, right? So you might have questions from first half, some of the stuff we talked about already, and some piece parts that we covered with our practical test, was going to be covered again using this exam format. So advantage to the exam format is it's, again, you don't have to code. There's no practical piece to it, so you don't have to connect to Azure. It's not going to be a technical issue. If you can't do something, you're going to be able to look at the code. That's the advantage. Disadvantage for me, because I'm more of a practical person, is it's multiple choice. So there's like, it's the hardest thing for me to put on is a multiple choice exam, because to me, especially if it's a code-based exam where I say, okay, this code, this code, this code, this code, they all look the same, and there's one different change. Which one is it? You have to know, right? So if you don't do that, I think that's a harder exam to me than a practical exam where you can test it out. Not that you won't have access to your tools, your Visual Studio and stuff, so you can still test it in your tools. You can actually run a little app, right, where you're during the exam and figure it out, right? I'm okay with that because that covers practical. If you think about it, it forces you to be practical anyway, which is, to me, kind of kills two birds with one stone. On the downside, for me also, which is a bad thing, and I'm just previewing this with you before we get going on this other stuff, and also giving you a chance to get this link up in Visual Studio, which you should have up by now. On the downside, also, when you do this kind of multiple choice stuff, if you don't know, you don't know. I mean, I go back to what my dad used to tell me when I was a kid. He who knows, knows, right? Which means, if you haven't practiced and if you haven't touched Visual Studio and if you've worked with somebody else the whole time, then you know what? The chances of you getting the exam, doing well in the exam will be lower because you don't have that much time. Or you might run into the 3-hour mark. It might take like the full time of the exam because you just don't know the stuff. And you're going to be looking things up and trying things out in Visual Studio, and there's going to be enough questions. Again, round 60. If you think about it, if each question takes you exactly a minute, right, and there'll be most of them, you'll be an hour, right? But some questions, especially if I make them a little bit more complex, just a little more complex, where you have to read a little bit, right? It might take you 30 seconds to read the bloody question, absorb everything. It might take you a minute, and now the questions are taking you 2 minutes. Now it's 2 hours, right? That's easily done, and that's the problem with multiple choice for me. I don't like it because either you know or you don't know. There's ways of cheating. That's another thing to do. That's not a bad thing. On the advantage, it gets marked automatically, so you get your mark when you leave the room, right? That's a good thing for me, right? So there's, again, positives and negatives about that. Okay, let's get to this stuff. So now that you've joined me here, that's the one thing we're going to look at is this ASP.NET overview. We're going to start with this one. Again, if I can get to the error handling piece, it looks like a lot, but actually it's not. We're going to talk about this as well. And then let's start off with some of the stuff we're talking about here by launching our application. So we're going to do a new application, similar to what we did last week with COMP2007 Lesson 10 Part 1. We're going to do another one. It's going to be COMP2007 Lesson 11 Part 1. And we might have a Part 2. We'll see how it goes. Okay, so let's start this off with, again, I'm going to go to this web page here, start you guys off. We'll rename it to COMP2007 Lesson 11 Part 1. I'm going to share myself on GitHub, so I'm going to keep these things together. It's going to go into my sandbox. I'm going to press OK. I'm going to press an empty application again, right? Again, there's some advantages to pressing web forms. We haven't really done this too much. The great thing is if you press this one, it comes with authentication. So some of you, I'm just mentioning this as in passing because you guys are smart guys, right? And girls. Some of you may have chosen this, right? Just go into web forms. And it creates a scaffold. And if you notice, it gives you authentication built in. This would cover your requirements for your assignment. You don't have to do it this way, how we've been doing it with empty. However, I'd like to mention this however, the big proviso here. When you go here, you have less control over what comes into your application than when you start from empty, right? which means you have to subtract stuff from here, whereas you add stuff on this side. So it really becomes a philosophy. Do you scaffold or do you not scaffold? And by the way, we do this, it's the same principle that we use for things like Node.js. If you're a Node.js kind of person and you're using the latest and greatest web technologies, sometimes there's this question, do I scaffold? You know, like using tools like Yeoman and Express, the Express generator or Angular generators, all this kind of stuff for doing Angular and Express. Or do we make it from scratch? And we add in things one step at a time. We have more control, right? The advantage of doing it from scratch, like we've been doing it so far, is you have the ability to scaffold your application on your own, create your own structure, all that kind of stuff. The advantage on the other way, if you let the scaffold do it for you, so one of these templates, right, is it builds it out. That's fantastic, right? On the plus side. On the minus side, you know, you have to figure out where everything is because it's not your stuff. It's somebody else's that you're going to learn and subtract from or add to, right? So that's the disadvantage. And it's the same thing. It doesn't matter what scaffold you look at out there. You have to understand the structure of the site structure. So that's a problem. So let's start off with this empty for now, and maybe if we have time, we'll kind of pull together this web forms one, you know, so that we start off with something. Okay. So I'm clicking empty. I'm also clicking this add additional code references, core references for web forms. And the reason for that, it adds a few extra folders for us, so we don't start from scratch. I'm going to press OK. Now, last time what we did was we added in some default stuff, and I don't want to start from scratch here on some of this stuff, so I want to kind of add it in really quickly. Now, I would have started from a template, but the problem with the template is it'll include stuff that we don't want, right? So my recommendation is, before we start off, to get things going, is let's go to the GitHub page that I've already got going on. And if I go to that other lesson, which is COMP2007 Lesson 10 Part 1, last week's lesson, in there we have a couple of files we can already grab from here. An example of this would be, if you notice, there's quite a bit of files we did last week, right? I want to grab some of this stuff over again just to be, you know, to kind of be ready. One of them is this default master page, right? Because I don't want to do this master page again. That's a pain in the arse, you know, as far as I'm concerned, right? So let's just grab this HTML stuff from the default master page online just to kickstart our application here instead of starting from scratch, because it's a pain in the ass, like I said. And grab it all the way down to the HTML tag here on the bottom. I'm going to Control C here. So if you notice, I'm just from the doc type all the way down, not touching the top, because we're going to have to create this master page. It's going to be default master, but it won't be this. So I've kind of copied everything into my clipboard. And now I'm going to create a new master page. I'm going to go right click, and I'm going to go add. And by the way, this is not a big issue for me if you're going to do this on an exam. If you need to kind of create a quick and dirty application, or if you prepare some stuff for yourself to reference on the exam, I'm okay with that because you're using your own code to learn from and to answer the questions, right? So I'm going to add, and then I go to Web Forms Master Page, which is what I want to do, right? Again, there's different ways of doing this. You can also go to New Item and get it from there. And I'm going to call this thing Default, just like we did last time. But instead of accepting that all this stuff, I'm just going to unpin these things for a second just to get these things going a little quicker, right? I'm going to just replace my doc type into the HTML with the stuff I've got from the clipboard, right? Which makes more sense to me. What do you think? Huh? Much faster? Okay, so I've got that stuff scaffolded nicely. That's a scaffold for you. Now I also need a couple of other things. I need to include, just to make sure that things will work, I'm going to right-click on my application, and I'm going to go to Manage Nuget Packages, and I'm going to add in a couple of packages. One of them is going to be Bootstrap. I'm going to install Bootstrap, so I need that. And I also need jQuery. I'm going to install that, just like we did last time. Because if you don't have those two, then that's a problem. Right? Sorry, just going to close the door. So Bootstrap and jQuery is what I've added in there, right? Now that's pretty cool. But if you notice in my up on top there, I have my I've added in the min theme. So here's my content, bootstrap.min the theme.css.min, this min.css, as well as the bootstrap min and my main.css, which I don't have, which I'm going to add in. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to add in my own main CSS just in case I need to add in my own style sheet. So here's my own main.css, which we may have to do today. And kind of save. I've almost got it ready because I've kind of scaffolded the default page for you. And you know what? I also want to add in some stuff that we did last week just to get going, because we want to. If you notice, there's a nav bar that we get. We have two nav bars, right? We have nav bar A and nav bar B. And if you notice, some of the stuff we did on the default master CS page. Remember, we did some stuff here on the page load. Well, we need to get that information too, right? So default masters.cs, I'm going to go back to GitHub, right? Instead of doing it all from scratch, like I said. Here's my default master.cs. And if you notice, we added in this little check to say, hey, if my HTTP context user identity is authenticated, then show one nav bar over the other. So if they're authenticated. So let's put that in there as well. We don't have that authentication yet going on. We don't have any authentication right now, in fact. We're going to add that in. And I'm just going to put that, just plop that in there, right? Because that's something that we should kind of add in. Now, just to make sure, I'm just going to go back to that GitHub. If you notice, I've got collections, link, web, providers, entities. Web providers, entities. That's one thing we have in here. And in here, we don't have web providers, entities. Why? Because we're not using the web providers method this way. We're using identity. This is a new thing we're going to do, right? So let's leave this in there as is. We're not going to touch this one. We also do need in here. We also need some kind of default pages. So let's add them in. I also want to kind of put in at least not the login page because we have to build that again, but definitely the my default page. So default.aspx, right? So let's go there. And I've got this little page. All I've got in there, if you notice, is my row that I'm kind of clicking in here with my jumbotron, right? So that's the only thing that's coming in. And we're going to make the to-do app again, right? But instead of doing the to-do app the way we did it last time, we'll just do it a different way. Actually, we have our to-do app. We have our database, right? Let's see if we can what we can do with it to recreate some of the same things. So now we need another page. I'm going to go right-click. I'm going to go add, and I'm going to go to web form with master page. And I'm going to click. My web form is going to be called default. So my default web form. And then here's my default master. I'm going to use that one, which is going to add that in. And inside my content in here, right? I'm going to just kind of drag and drop that stuff with row and the jumbotron and all that kind of stuff. We're going to build this to-do app again. Okay, so let's run this app and see what happens right now, because we've added a couple things, and just to make sure that things work with, just as a basic platform for getting going, we're pretty good, right? We should have this right now. Now, I don't have a login page that takes me to ASPX. I don't have a register page that registers me. Can't do that, right? But the reason why this nav bar is showing up and not the other one is I'm not authenticated. I don't have that authentication piece in at all. All right. Now is the time we're gonna kind of follow through with our app. So I think this is a great place to stop, and I'm going to put everything up here on GitHub. So if you guys want to follow along at home or want to try this out from scratch, you can certainly get to this the code example up online. So I'm going to go to Team Explorer. I'm going to go to Changes, and if you see there's all kinds of changes. Remember that a Team Explorer sometimes includes untracked files down here, which we don't want. And I'm going to add in created base a VS project, for ASP.NET web forms, something like that, and then press commit. Kind of a bigger commit, home, unsync commits, and I need this URL, and of course I'm going to get that from my GitHub page, right, which I haven't created yet. I'm going to create a new project, a new repository, and I'm going to create it up online. I'm going to call it COMP2007 lesson 11 part 1, right? So create that repository and grab this, a little bit of a link, go back in here, and then publish that branch. So that publishes the branch up to COMP2007 lesson 11 part 1, which you'd have, if you haven't done this up to now, or if you're behind me and you don't want to do your typing and you're a little bit lazy, but you want to do what I did, download what I just did. You just got everything you need. All right, nothing you need there other than what I've given you so far. And then you're up to speed with me. Okay, so we've got our default master, we've got our default stuff. I think we're pretty much ready to go. One of the things we're going to be working on a lot today is with web.config. Web.config is really, it's going to generate our kind of the way we do stuff. A lot of the authentication we're going to be using is going to be based in here. We're going to type some stuff in our web.config to make it go, right? Let's start with this identity stuff. Okay. So we talked about membership, and this great page here, what it does is it talks a little bit about, I'm just going to kind of lower this, I think it's a little bit too big. There we go. It talks a lot about, in a very wordy way, and very nice way, about ASP.NET membership and how it evolved into ASP.NET Identity and the whole idea of universal providers which we used, right? So the great thing about identity is, and here's some points when it comes to identity, and these are the following goals it had. One, ASP.NET Identity System. Ease of plugging in profile data about the user. So if you're going to use a profile, right, a user profile, not just a username and password, but other things, then that's a really cool thing. Persistent control, unit testability, that's cool. A role provider, similar to what we had in membership, right? It's claims-based. Claims is kind of weird. It's also instead of using the role, claim and a role is kind of very similar in that it allows you to pull for what the person has, what access the person has according to the system and what he's accessing. OWIN integration, which allows you to use things like it's a middleware-based system. So by the way, if you're using, if you're familiar with or Node.js as an example, if you've done any kind of Node.js or whatever, they use middleware all the time to do their authentication. This is more of the way that OWIN works, in that they use a middleware. And middleware is another piece of software or another piece of logic that controls access to authenticate the user. And on top of that, you can also use things like third-party authorization services like Facebook, if you want to log in with Facebook and GitHub and all that kind of stuff, which is the more modern approach to authentication. Now there is it's been redistributed as a Nuget package, which is really cool, which is automatically installed with ASP.NET MVC, right? If you actually do your web forms scaffold, it uses identity, right? So if you just went right from there, and your web API, these templates we're talking about are already there. But if we want to do it from scratch, then if you notice, they're talking here MVC, where you actually add an MVC template, and what it does is it creates this ASP.NET identity framework, right? And it creates these pages here, right? Which allows things like anonymous. We're going to skip some of this piece because what I need to get to, right, from an identity perspective is the stuff that, and this is kind of cool, it gives you this diagram. And if you look at the diagram to understand identity a little bit, right, it talks about how to do stuff a little differently with identity than we do with membership. So again, it kind of talks about the links, how everything is linked together. Right? So from identity, from a diagram perspective, that's components of identity. So when we create this stuff, if I want to make a login page or whatever, it gives us the information on how to do this stuff right in here, right? This is a register page or a login page. They're using MVC, right? We're not going to be using MVC. We're going to be using things like, I'm just going to make sure I got the right link for you, but we're going to be using things like, if I go to samples, so if I go to ASP.NET Identity Nuget samples, that's one thing we can look at as well, right? They actually go through their how to install identity ASP.NET samples right inside Nuget, right? And what we're going to be doing is we're actually going to go, and this is just kind of an overview of how things work. We don't want to use identity, but we want to use, membership. We want to use identity. In order for us to get there, we need to add in some Nuget packages to make this stuff work. So how do we do that? So let's go back to ASP.NET. Here we are. And I want to go here, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to manage Nuget packages. Let's do this. And one day, when this comes up, mine takes a little longer than some of the other ones do. All right. So here's our our Nuget, and we want to add in identity. So I search for, if I just search for identity, right? What do I get? Well, I get Microsoft ASP Net Identity, right? And it says the entity with the entity framework, right? The other one is, you see Owen Identity Core, right? As an example, there's a bunch of different ones. So which one do I add in? If this is the Owen implementation for ASP.NET Identity, right? And if you notice, the dependencies are ASP.NET Identity Core, Owen Security Auth, OAuth, which gives us the ability to log in with Facebook. So if I do this one, you get this one. If I do this one, then you get Core, right? That's what this one happens. So this one, Owen, if I just install this one uses the entity framework, and this is kind of one we want to use. We want to use the entity framework for identity. And this one uses Core, right? And it also uses the entity framework 2.6.1, right? This one uses just this stuff, right? But however, it doesn't use entity framework, right? And which is, it's fine either way. I'm okay with either one, right? But let's stick with this one, identity with Owen, and then kind of install this one. When I do that, look at all the ones it adds in, right? And I accept. And if you notice, there's going to be a bunch that are checked in a second. All right, so these are the ones that get checked off, whether one or the other. Once you add Owen in there, you get Identity Core. Okay, so that's the first one you need, right? If you notice, from a references perspective, now you've got Owen security built in and security OAuth. That's all in there, right? Because that kind of limits you for what you can do. And we want to kind of add in a login page and all that kind of stuff. We want to create a login page that does it a little differently than what we did last time. Very similar to what we did last time in terms of logging in and logging out. But we're not going to, there's some basic controls that we can drag and drop. If I drag and drop my login controls now, right? My login controls, what do they use? My basic login controls. The ones we did last week, guys. So if I go here to Toolbox, right? And if I go to my login controls, what do these login controls give us? Does it give us identity? No, they don't. This is membership. So if you do this login stuff, and if I create a default login page or whatever, and I use this, right? Once I drag in a login name and a login status and all this kind of stuff, all these things do is they create a component that kind of creates the your database, your local database, local DB, that allows you to log in and log out, right? Now I don't have membership. If I just run this thing as is, let's just run it. I've added a package, but I haven't added anything else in there. I haven't added in login or register. There is no login page right now, right? So there is nothing that happens here that's giving me an error because there's no error to be had, right? I don't have an About Us page yet, and I don't have a Contact Us page yet because we never included those, right, in our last application. We made a very quick and dirty kind of login screen, right? So what do we do? Let's go back to that page. So one of the things we want to do is, if you notice, from an MVC perspective, if we were going to go this way, and if you notice, MVC, which is a different template, includes Entity Framework, the Identity Core, and Owen, right? If I add in the Entity Framework, once I add that in, it gives us a different set of rules to create stuff in there, in addition to the stuff that we're doing, right? So that's another add-in. Now it requires what we just put in there, but if you notice in here, I have when I make a register page, the register button itself has an action that's built onto it that allows us to authenticate and log in. And the same thing goes with our different tasks when we log in and so on. Now this is not what we want. This is a neat idea of the components identity and all that kind of stuff. What we want is, again, we want those two things, the Owen security and the entity framework for those two things. But what I want to do is create a non-MVC app. I want to make ASP.NET, identity is what I want to have in there, right? So I want to use ASP.NET with identity as opposed to just with MVC, right? Now, if you notice what it says here, it says if I go ASP individual user accounts with using web projects in the Visual Studio 2013, if you go there, right, it's going to take you to how do you create individual user accounts, right? And it gives you a sample of using the template. This is using the template and logging in with the cloud and all that kind of stuff. And you can choose between organizational accounts and user accounts or Windows accounts. That's not the one I want. I want a sample that builds out an ASP.NET web form, right, that uses identity. So I go back up here for a second. And this is but if I click that link and if I go to the top, this actually shows us how I create web projects in Visual Studio 2013. So if you notice, it takes us through the whole step of clicking through, and we click the empty form, which is what we just did. We don't want to host things in the cloud. We don't need to do that. We clicked web forms, and now what they do is they use the scaffold for web forms to create everything, right? And then they can choose between identity, kind of logging in with the scaffold as an example. And they talk about other types of web projects, right? When we do the step through. And then it kind of comes up with this ASP.NET stuff that's got built-in identity and everything else in the back end. Okay? That's not what we want. So let's go back. So then how do I navigate this stuff to add it in? Woiled, that's right, woiled. You missed it from last week. I'm going to stop debugging for a second, and I'm going to unpin this control here from the side. And what I'm also going to do here is on the right side, if you notice, right? I've got this, I'm going to just collapse this side here. I want to create a login page. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go right click, I'm going to go a new add web form with master page, and I'm going to choose the login page. So it's going to be called login.aspx, right? So I'm going to press OK. And I'm going to choose the default master as the page that I'm going to refer to, right? There's my login page. Now remember, when I go to my default.aspx, just to make sure that I've got everything correct, or sorry, my default master, not the CS file, the default master page shows, just unpin this so you can see it a little better. From a navigation perspective, I've kind of planned out an about page, a contact page, a register page, and a login.aspx page, right? That's in my public nav. When I go to my private nav later on, I'll be doing this, right? Then I only want to see a log out page based on login status. So there's my login status control. But that's only available when I'm physically logged in, right? So I've got to be able to control my login and log out. How do I do that? Okay. Just to be safe, and here's a question for you. If I added in entity framework, if I would go back to Nuget, and if I was just from a building perspective, a scaffolding perspective, if I add in entity framework through Nuget again right now, and then I also did later on, we are going to build a to-do list again. If I asked to do ADO.NET data model with entity framework, will it try to add entity framework again? The answer is no. Once I have my reference, it knows that I have that dependency, so it won't add in anything new. So it's not going to hurt us to add in the entity framework stuff in there as well. To be safe, to make sure that we've got everything we need to do proper authentication, if we're going to go do things through entity framework, let's go back into Nuget and add in that other piece. So we're going to go manage Nuget Packages, and I'm going to go in here and go identity. Right? When I click identity, it's going to show me this top level package. Now I've already got the core. It's just going to add in the framework, right? Just to make sure that I've got everything I need to get my stuff done. So I'm going to kind of click install here. And accept. So it's going to add in a couple of other packages in here. So what does this do when I start off with this thing? If I go back to my web config, so I'm going to I don't need this anymore, right? This is my default master page. I'm going to definitely modify my login page because there's nothing in here right now. I'm going to add in some form information. But in my web.config page, if you notice, I got all kinds of crap in here now. Right? Take a look. This is all the stuff that was added in from my entity framework, right? So here's my section for entity framework, 6.0, right? And my target .NET framework 4.5, right? And I got a default factory for system.data.entity.infrastructure. So all this stuff got added in, and a provider for this part here got added in for my security. This is my security provider, which is systems.data.SQL client, right? That's my provider that gets added in when I added not just my entity framework, but also my security stuff. Okay, it's just things to note that the way things work, right? Now here's an interesting thing. If I was going to remember last week, how did I stop stuff from going to a particular location? Remember we had a kind of an idea of if I don't want a certain site being accessed, there's two ways to do that with ASP.NET Web Form Security. Which is the first way? I kind of talked about this last week. Yeah, if you guys are here, I'm looking at Steve because maybe Steve might know. Steve, tell me, what are the two ways I can protect sites or site pages? Sorry? Can't really do it at the database level. If I wanted to go to a site, like a default site, that's crazy, yeah? That's protecting it on every page. To make sure if the user is authenticated, I can say if user authenticated, is authenticated, then you can look at this page. Otherwise, redirect, right? If the user is not authenticated, I can redirect, response.redirect, and then I can redirect them to another page. That's response.redirect is the code that you need in the C# on the code behind files, right? The other way to do it is to protect a location, right? A location. So let's say, as an example, I wanted to do location. So if I put in here location, let's just start typing location here, right? Let's put that in there. So if I say location, here it is, right? And one of the things that I have in my location, if I start typing protection, right? We're going to do this. We're doing this kind of backwards, right? Ask backwards. But if I do a path, here's my path. And if I say my path for my location, if I put a path in there, like example, if I want to go to my my main page, my default or a certain path or whatever, I can specify a path, like anything that's inside a certain folder, my folder, let's say. Don't type this, I'm just showing you what I'm talking about. So if I want to go to my folder, if I want to protect that whole folder, anything that's in that folder is going to be protected by my path, right? So I don't have a folder like that right now, but just to demonstrate this, and again, I want to talk about security a little bit more in detail. Let's create a folder and with our Solution Explorer, we're going to put a couple of dummy files right now. So we're going to kind of make this up. And if you notice, we have some scripts and everything else. Let's say we had another section of our database, and we called it, secret. We're going to make it a secret section, right? So I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to click Add, and I'm going to go New Folder, right? And under my new folder, I'm going to make this folder called Secret with a capital S, Secret. In our Secret folder, I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to add, right, a new Web Forms with master page, right? Web Forms with master page, and it's going to be called my index.html, index with a capital I, but it's inside my secret. Okay, bear with me here while we do this. I'm going to use my default master and press OK. So in my index.html, this one, right, we're going to just say, just in the content here, in this between lines 4 and 5, I'm going to make, just to prove that we're getting there, I'm going to go, I'm going to make an h1 tag, and inside the h1 tag is shh, right? Shh, secret, right? That's my h1 tag, right? So that we know we can get to there. If I can get to there, there's a couple ways to protect ourselves right now. I can stop it by having, this is just by having, by the way, the framework in place. For me not having anything else, just the framework. I haven't asked for login information, nothing, right? Okay. So let's scaffold this out. So anything that's inside, I want everything that's inside the secret to be stopped. Okay. So instead of my location path being my folder now, I want my location path being anything that's inside this secret folder. So anything that's inside the secret folder, and if you really want to specify a good path, you can use that little tilde sign, right? Secret folder. I want to have a system.web component in there. And inside my system.web, right, I want to, from an authentication perspective, right, if you notice, there is no authorize yet. But from an authentication perspective, I want to open up another thing here that says Actually, it's not authentication. It says sorry. It's not authentication. It's authorization. One more time. Authorization. Authorization. I love it. Right. Authorization. I want to say allow or deny. Here's deny. Deny users, right? That we don't know. If we don't know the user, we're going to deny them all. So if you can't go in, if you try and go into secret anything, right? Here's our path. Then any users that are not authorized are going to be bounced, as an example, right? They won't allow you to go anywhere. So it bounces you, says unauthorized. It basically come back with unauthorized. It won't redirect you to the login page, right? Because if you notice, if I go here and I ask for what happens, I can lock items and so on, right? It doesn't tell me where I'm going to redirect. It doesn't tell me what I'm going to be doing. Roles, I can look for roles or whatever. System.web, if anytime you look at any of these things, so location, path, if I open this up, it says allow override, inherited child applications. It gives you actually some code hinting of what else can go in there, right? Okay, let's leave that as is. And if I press, kind of run, let's see what that does now. So I'm running this thing. It reads the web config, right? And I'm just going to type it in here. I'm going to go /secret, right? /index.aspx. Let's just type that in and see what we get. Well, I can get in there, right? Secret. How come it didn't stop me? There's pieces that I'm missing, right? For my my configuration, right? Even though I've gone there, it allows me to go in there because I'm going into my secret file. I can get in there even though I'm not supposed to be able to get in there unless I log in. I haven't created a login yet or anything like that, but I want to say, hey, if the location path is secret, and just to test that out, make sure that I've done it correctly, let's take that tilde off. And let's check that out again. So I'm going to kind of refresh this page, and what does it give me? It gives me an internal error. Let's see if you guys get this thing too. So here I'm just going to refresh, and that's not, of course, it gives me an internal error because I've been running things. Hold on a second. So let's just rebuild this whole thing, and then I get an. Do you guys get this internal error right away?
No.
What do you guys get? Well, here's my location path. It's pointing. If you did what I did, it tells me where my problem lies. It says it's here in secret, right? Well, I know what I did, right? I put my tilde back, right? So that's all I did. All I did was I changed my tilde, right? And if I go back, I run it now. She runs, right? Why? Because it doesn't know where to check, right? Just to give you a little bit of a brief, right, on how that works. Okay. So that's the first thing. So how do I then, and if I drag and drop some controls, remember what we talked about before. If I go to my Solution Explorer here, right, and if I go to my login page, here's my login page, right, and now I want to create a login, right? And if I go, I'm going to stop debugging here. And if I go to my server controls here, if I go to my toolbars, let's see what happens when I drag and drop some controls in here. I'm just going to show you the whole gamut. Oh, that's not what I wanted to do. View, Solution Explorer. I want to just unpin it. If I drag and drop a login or a login status, one of those kind of things, one of these controls. So let's say I drag and drop this login status in here, right? Here's my login status control. When I save it, and I go back to my web config, right, does anything change, right? I still get all this. I still got my configurations and my sections and my providers. It looks like I've got the same kind of stuff that happened before. So nothing's really changed in my web config when I do just a login status, right, of my login page. When I go to my login page, it gives me my login status. Let's run this thing step by step and see what happens. So I run it, right? I've dragged and dropped my login status. If I click login, I do have a login page now. It takes me here and it says login, right? Now, it doesn't go anywhere because right now my login status tells me whether I'm logged in or not. And right now, I'm logged out. Otherwise, it'd be a login. right? This would be changed. Okay, here's when the changes really happen. Stop debugging. And I'm going to go back to my toolbox. Here's my toolbox again. If I grab and drag and drop in a login page now, on top of my login status, which is right here. Right, here's my login control. Okay, and now with my login control, remember what comes with it, right? If I look at the design view, right, it looks like this. Kind of gives me some basic styling and a remember and all this kind of stuff, right? That's what it does. And all I've done is dragged and dropped in a login control. That's all I've done. I don't have a register page yet. Okay, let's check this out and see what happens. So I'm going to run it. It's going to take me to my login page, and when it does, I get this freaking error, right? What's the error again? Remember how we fixed this one?
I think that it's in the globe.
Does anyone remember? It's not in the. There's two ways we can do this thing, right? We can use the unobtrusive validation mode, none. Mode is equal, value is equal to none, which stops our jQuery validation, right? Or we can put that script in that we saw last week, which I gave it to you already last week, okay? To prevent this problem from happening. Okay, so let's go back into our here and stop debugging, right? And if I go into web config now, I have nothing that's changed. But remember what I need to add in here. I need to add this one piece to take away that problem. So I'm going to unpin this stuff here. Okay, and if you know, it's this section above system.web and below this config section, right? What is it that I add in there, right? I want to add in an app settings section, and I want to add, right? What am I adding? A key, right? Which is that long frickin' error, right? Which is, go back to my error, unobtrusive validation mode, right? This one here. That's the error that I want to add in. So if I want to see the actual code instead of me trying to swim around for it, let's go into my last week's PowerPoint presentation to see that. Same thing. So here's my 2007. Under last week's lesson, right, we did a little PowerPoint. I'll bring it up for you. Yeah. I love these little errors. And on the bottom, well, this is one problem we have to kind of avoid. Right at the bottom of the form, pretty much, it tells us we need to do two things, right? The authentication mode inside of our system.web, we need to add in this authentication mode is equal to forms authentication, right? So let's go back in there. That needs to be in there. So that's inside my system.web. So we go in here, we go authentication mode, mode is equal to forms authentication, right? And we don't need the extra tag. It's a self-closing tag, and I don't know why, but they kind of broke this. They kind of broke this in this version of ASP.NET. Okay, so that's one thing that has to come in, and then this key. If I go back to my PowerPoint, this key is this key right here. This key is validation settings, unobtrusive validation mode, and then if you choose web forms, you have to put the script in there. Let's not put the script in this time. And let's just use web forms by itself. So let me type it in for you. So validation settings, colon, let's put it in there, in the key. And it doesn't give you unfortunately, it doesn't give you the code hinting. If I go control space or anything like that, the code hinting doesn't come out. Validation settings, right? And if I go back here, so validation settings, colon, and then no space, unobtrusive validation mode, capitals, camel case, right? Unobtrusive validation mode, right? And then the value, also you're going to type in here, the value is going to be none. If you put value none in there, and again, I'm just going to check my spelling, unobtrusive validation mode. Unobtrusive validation mode, that's good, I'm good to go. And again, I've put my app settings in there. Okay. And then again, of course, I've turned authentication mode on because I'm saying it's forms type authentication. I've kind of kicked on, once you do this, you kick on forms authentication. Okay. Now, I'm going to run this thing again and see what happens. So here, I'm going to go run it. And if everything goes well, then it should take me to my front page, which it does. Let me just kill some of these pages here, just so that way I don't drive you all crazy, right? And if I go, let's check this out. If I go to secret like I did before, and my index.aspx page, right, and I press enter, it still allows me to get in there, right? So I can get into that secret place. But I shouldn't be able to get in there. We're going to try and stop that in a second. All right. So that's one. The other thing is if I click login now, and if I go and try and log in, right? So if I go, and this is where it gets a little hairy. If I go Tom, and then I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's my login, for Tom, right? And I'm going to choose. Let's say remember next time, sure. And I click login. It's going to do a couple things now with just that piece. When I do this the first time, it's going to say, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't get in, right? It won't allow me to get in. But let's take a look at what it does on the back end. So here, if I look at the web config, has anything changed in the web config? No, hasn't changed anything here from a config sections perspective. So I'm not logged in or anything like that, right? But however, and I'm going to stop debugging for a second. If I go to my server explorer, right, and again, I want to look at some servers that are local. Right, so I want to look at my SQL Server Object Explorer is really what I want to look at. And I have my local DB. So here's my projects v12. If I go to databases, I've got my EF demo. Where's my database for my my latest little database? I don't have that, right? It does create it locally though. There's a local DB that I can look into that actually creates a table in my database that kind of authenticates me. So going with the old way of authentication, all I've done is dragged and dropped this my login page. Here's my login page, right? And now there's a couple things that are missing when I try and log in. If you guys remember, first of all, I'm going to go to the source code version. So here's my login, and let me just pull this in. And I haven't styled this thing at all. We're going to try and style this thing today. So here's my login. And I'm going to go to my properties, pin that up for a second. I remember there's a couple things we had to change from the last time that allow us to do things. So client mode inherit, CSS class. We're not applying CSS class, but we will. Right? We're gonna apply the CSS class for our login page for anything to do with. We're gonna use Bootstrap. Why not? Right? We got our failure text. Hey, your login was unsuccessful. Please try again. That's the login failure text, right? And if you notice, there's some other pieces that we're missing. Our login back color, our login that says login. The login button type is button. The membership provider, right? We can put that in there as well. Orientation of the button. Password is required if we have a required message when we try and do that. Running at the server, a tab index, a text box, all these things that are in there before. But what we really need, if you look at the PowerPoint from last week, just as a review, and when we drag and drop in our login, we need a destination page URL, right, which would be our new secret page, right, and this create user text, sign up for a new account, and then we're going to, instead of the create user URL being sign up, we're going to make a register page, just like we did last time, right? So how do we do that? Let's go in there and check that out. So destination page URL. Let's see where that is. So here's my destination page URL. All right, and if you click the ellipses will take you to the destination. I want to go into secret index.aspx and press OK. So it actually puts in the proper path. Okay, so that's where it takes us when we're logged in, right? Now remember what it's going to do. If we log in successfully and go to the secret page, whatever that secret page is, right? It's also going to swap out our nav bar, right? And put in our new nav bar that shows us that we're logged in with that if we're logged in or not, right? That's one thing it's going to do. It's also, when we do log in, going back to this, right? If we want to, for creating the user, if the user doesn't exist, we're going to change this create user text to register for a new account. So here's create user text, register for a new account. and create user icon. We don't need that. Create user URL. We don't have that right now, but we're going to make it, and it's going to be register. So leave that blank for now. And in order for us to prepare for this, I'm going to go to Solution Explorer, and I'm going to create a new register page, right? So I'm going to go, so there's login, and I'm going to right click on here. I'm going to go add, and we're going to do a new web forms with master page, and we're going to call this register with a capital R. Here's a register with a default master. Press OK. Here's our register page. Okay, inside of register page, inside of our main content here, just to go with what we did before, right? If you notice, I've got what I did before. We used this create user wizard. Remember? Create user wizard. It's just as a review. So I'm going to drag and drop the create user wizard in there, which gives us a few other options, which we're going to have to configure in a second. Okay, so there's our registration page. We have a register page. Let's go back into that login page for a second. And I'm clicking on the login control now. And I'm going into properties. So here's our login control. And then where it says create user URL, I can now select my register page. You can also have typed it in, but the good thing about this is it kind of, selects where I'm going, right? Okay, cool. So now I'm going to register a new user, right? And when I register a new user without any other changes, I'm going to go back to the register ASPX page for a second. If I go to my design view, right, it's going to look like this ugly form, right? This ugly form that we have here. Now, if you wanted to change it out, if you wanted to change the styling of this form, which we didn't do kind of last week, which we're going to try and do today, if I click this little smart arrow here, right? Right now it says default to master's content. That's one thing it will do, right? And I can also go back into create an event when my user goes in there. I want to change my content though, because I don't want to actually look at this for a second. Let's go back here, right? So here, if you notice, I've got my main content custom. It says that's what my custom main content is. And on the right, when I've clicked onto it, it says auto format, add remove wizard steps, convert to start navigation template. This is very interesting. Convert to finish navigation template, convert to custom navigation template. Again, administer website. That's very important. When you click administer website, actually what it does is it goes in and it allows us to create users. We're going to go back in here in a second later on. After we click this the first time, I just want you to notice this stuff. Okay. Yeah.
How do you get those buttons?
Here?
Yeah.
I've clicked on this.
I already did.
Are you going to get these buttons? Do you guys get these buttons?
Yes, I do. I don't.
So let me just go back and I'll do this. I'll go back to source mode and I'll go back out to, I'll click away and go back to design mode. And as soon as I click on this item, I get these buttons, right? If I go to source mode, I click away, but if I click there on this main create user wizard thing, I get these buttons and I get all these properties. Okay, but for now, let's leave it as is. So I'm going to go Chrome. I'm going to run it. And here's my register page. So this is where my register page will take me. And I've got a bit of an issue, right? It says, an error occurred during the application of a resource, right? Required to service this request. Please review the following specific error details and modify your source code appropriately. Compile error message. ASP register ASPX does not contain a definition for create user wizard, create user, and no extension method create user wizard, create user, except a first argument of type ASP register.aspx could be found. Are you missing a using directive or an assembly reference? And we are. Because remember what the register user does. Register user and login, does it work for him? I asked you, did it work for identity? And the answer is it does not. It works for membership, right? So that's why it's not understanding what to do here. If I go back from a compilation error, it doesn't stop me from compiling. I can drag and drop my stuff in here, but I need other piece parts for me to make this registration wizard thing work. So before we move on, because I've kind of taken you to this point to show you the differences, right? We've got our registration page, right? And if I was to, right now what I'm going to ask you to do is I'm going to take this away, this create user wizard, and leave my placeholder data in there just for my own perspective, right? Just take it away. And if I was to refresh this page and go to my user, I should have nothing. It should come up with nothing, right? It should be an empty page just with my my thing here. If I notice login, here's my login. If I have a user account, if I try to log in, this works, this piece. And then look at my register for a new account actually works as well. But this piece doesn't work because I can't, there's nothing to connect to. So if I go, you know, my login code and press login, even though I know I have a backend that's worked before, right, for another application, it won't connect to anything. I haven't created a user table, and it hasn't created a user table because I haven't registered for the first time anybody, and I can't register because I'm not using membership. I'm using identity, and that's a totally different thing. So let's take a short break, and I'll get back to using identity and how to fix all this problem when we get back.